This evening, we'll hear from Melissa Potter about her practice as an artist, curator, and writer whose interdisciplinary practice has spanned more than 2 decades, interpreting and protecting women's traditional practices globally. Potter explores these practices as a distinct language and history and focuses on traditions that are threatened by war, industrialization, and climate crisis. Through interdisciplinary collaborations with ethnographers, activists, scientists, and artists, her multimedia projects range from felt making in the Tusheti region of Republic of Georgia to Feminist Seed Bank, an interpretive archive project documenting women whose plant-based practices are evolving in the era of climate collapse. Potter started her career as a hand paper maker, which she explores as a feminist and socially engaged practice. Currently, she practices hand paper making to investigate climate change through the plants from which she makes paper. Melissa H. Potter's work has been exhibited and screened in venues including White Columns, Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and the Reeling International LGBT Film Festival. Potter has been the recipient of 3 Fulbright Awards, as well as funding from CEC Arts Link, Trust for Mutual Understanding, and Soros Fund for Arts and Culture, all of which enabled her to build 2 papermaking studios in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Melissa developed research, documentary, and advocacy projects with ethnographers and intangible heritage experts to protect, interpret, and archive endangered women's handicrafts and social customs. As a curator, Potter's exhibitions include social paper, hand paper making in the context of socially engaged art with Jessica Cochran, and Revolution at Point Zero, feminist social practice with Nisa Page Lieberman. Her critical essays have been printed in Bomb, Art Papers, and Flash Art, among others. Please join me in welcoming our friend and colleague, Melissa H. Potter, to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's actually really intimidating to speak to such a group of people, but most of all, it's intimidating to speak to a group of people whose opinions matter so much to me. I'm really, really pleased to be speaking tonight and want to thank, in addition to the wonderful thank yous of Heather, I want to thank he's not my chair, he's now my director of the School of Visual Arts, Duncan McKenzie, who's so supportive. I want to thank Jay and Gina and Philip, Heather, who's been so kind and helpful tonight, and also to all of my students. I really adore working with you and my colleagues who are always so supportive. I start with 3 images which sort of exemplify the work that I do. This is an image from a project I did in Republic of Georgia, trying to protect and preserve the intangible heritage practice of felt in the Tusheti region of the Republic of Georgia. Here we are on horseback at the border of Dagestan, which is a country adjacent to Republic of Georgia. And we were using an ancient craft and ritual to scare away the devil during the fertility cult rituals at the beginning of the year. That's me in the middle. I was the Jersey Devil. I was born and raised in New Jersey. And these projects were done in tandem with activists in Republic of Georgia who were using these masks to hide their identities during protests where they were receiving death threats. This is an image of a project from my Seeds and Service project, which was done here at the Papermaker's Garden on the Columbia College Chicago campus. This is Rosario E., who was the first woman, undocumented Mexican, to go on record about the sexual abuse of women in the agricultural sector. A man can catch you in the fields where the plants are taller than you. This was part of dinner event that I did at the Papermaker's Garden, looking at the intersection of women's work in agriculture and the seeds that we were growing for art material. And then this is an image from a project that I did with University of Chicago Professor Larissa Yasharovich, who's a climate expert, climate anthropologist, and the class was on end times. And it was a really interesting way to consider hand paper making in the context of end times climate theory. The students made scrolls for these kind of time capsules talking about end times theory, but it exemplifies the way that pedagogy is really important. Teaching and my practice really work hand in hand with the way that I make art. So I started my career after the NATO offensive in the year 2000. That was the end of the NATO offensive against the Balkans, specifically against Belgrade. And I received funding from ArtsLink, CEC ArtsLink. George Soros was a big proponent of democratization through the cultural sector concept. But this was happening all throughout the former Soviet states and into the Middle East. And so I received a grant to go to the former Yugoslavia, specifically to Serbia. And I was working with ethnobotanists and ethnographers to study the plants that were locally available in the region and consider the ways that they could be engaged in a hand paper making context, because that was my medium. I've been making handmade paper since I was 18 years old. So this is a map of former Yugoslavia, specifically the region of Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Montenegro, and Kosovo. And the highlights are all the villages that I was visiting. So part of my work was traveling all throughout this region and starting to record the intangible heritage practices that I was witnessing. I realized very quickly that in many cases, they were the last proponents or the last people actually doing these practices. I came across people like these three ladies. This is still my very favorite photo that I've ever taken from the region, a little tiny village in Jagodina. These are three women who were weavers, but they live in what looks like Snow White's castle or Snow White's home. And this is what are now understood to be the ghost villages. There are ghost villages all over the world, but basically what happened over time was there were these very traditional societies that were taking place that were agriculturally focused, had a lot of craft practices that were happening in them. And over time, people were being forced into the cities for work. They were also being forced out of the country through globalization to come to different, in particular the United States, to come work in different fields. But so what happened was the pressure on the intangible heritage practice meant that there was no one left basically to transfer their craft practices to. So I'm sure these women are long gone, and it's highly unlikely that they ever passed on their traditions. So I started becoming fascinated with how could I participate in engaging my own practice in hand paper making craft with this intangible heritage movement. So I embedded myself in the Ethnographic Museum in Belgrade. I insinuated myself on Sasha Srećković, who's one of my best friends and an UNESCO Intangible Heritage Manager. And I started traveling around and doing more sort of recording and looking at the ways that I could embed an artistic practice into the region. This is an image from my 2015 Fulbright in Bosnia, Herzegovina. This is a project called BOSFAM, it's Bosnian family. It works with women war survivors, many of whom are rape and violence survivors during the siege that happened in their city of Sarajevo and in their villages. The image you see behind is from the Srebrenica massacre quilt. So the women were brought together and reinvigorated their hand practice of rug making kilim, which is a practice in that region. And they were commemorating as a permanent memorial the people in their lives who had been killed during the genocide. This became really, really informative of my practice, looking at the ways that women's work, cross-generational transference, and trauma all intersect, and the ways that they can work towards healing and reconstituting a new environment for people. So this was happening concurrent with building studios in hand paper making, which was super intoxicating. Hand paper making is a very little known medium outside of Columbia College, but it's even lesser known around the world. And so the students they had just survived a war. And so they were really intrigued with this new medium they had never experienced before. So it was very easy for me to sort of get into a studio setting and work with people to engage them and to excite them about a new medium. The image on the left is one of my first students, Viktor Mitajovic. taken in 2000, we were raiding people's kitchens to get the materials and supplies because there weren't really materials and supplies available. But what started happening was I was traveling all throughout the region and dozens of people would show up. So it became this really interesting communication tool. This is the studio that I built in Bosnia. For those of you who are not aware, Serbia and Bosnia, the Balkans had a war. And during that war, Serbia and Bosnia were at war with one another. The Serbs did a siege on the city of Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it was an incredible opportunity. I had a Fulbright in 2006, and then in 2009, working in Serbia. And then in 2015, had the opportunity to do another Fulbright in Bosnia. But to have that experience to work across these borders was really pretty intense. What happened was I ultimately trained a generation of students because I was so obsessed with being in the region that I went back 34 times. So a few years ago, I had a young student, well, he's not so young anymore, named Milan. And he was making huge, like wall-sized pieces of paper. And I said, wow, that's really cool. Where did you learn how to do that? And he said, are you nuts? I was in your first class in, the year 2000. And this was like 18 years later. So it's been, for me, as an intangible heritage practice person, it's been a really fascinating way to look at the ways that my own practice has become cross-generational and informative of the next generation making art and doing what they do. This is an image from, so Soros continued its funding of the former Soviet states towards this concept of democracy building well into the 2000s. I wrote this grant with Clifton Metter and Miriam Scher, who were in the Center for Book and Paper when I was working over there. And Gina Ordaz, I'm pretty sure, oversaw a lot of the details around those grants. So this was a project called Feminist Felt, where we went to Republic of Georgia. And this is Ida Bakhtarijde, who was my interdisciplinary worker. I learned very quickly that it's important for people in the West to be working with experts in the country in order to build trust in the communities where we were trying to work. So she was part of the Women's Fund in Georgia and helped us network with 4 workshops in the Tusheti region, which is a very remote region of the Republic of Georgia, way to the east of the country. These women have a 92% domestic violence rate. And so it was very clear to me that in addition to having the Women's Fund in Georgia, I also needed an ethnographer, Sasha Srečković, who was going to help me basically invoke the IRB ethical methodologies that would allow me to interface with these women in an ethical way, as well as the Peace Corps and some translators. So we had a really big team working with us in these 4 workshops, learning the art of felt and trading in exchange our knowledge of books. So we were actually doing felted books with them, and they taught us how to do their felt practice. In the city of Tbilisi, we worked with the same activists who went out into the regions with us and helped us interface with the women in the workshops and learn and do a Skillshare exchange. And we developed activist banners and masks for them to be able to do their work, doing things like virginity protests. So in the Republic of Georgia, there were still virginity protests taking place back when we were doing this project in 2013-14. Some of the women from Women's Fund in Georgia were receiving death threats. So the masks became really important because they were wearing them during their protests and couldn't be identified. Some of those women have been forced to come to the United States. One of them works for the Estrella Foundation, but the stakes are very, very high for activists working in these countries. And so we did a lot of work around feminist consciousness raising. This is Shulamith Firestone, who's one of the cornerstones of early feminist theory. And so we did a lot of work thinking about the kinds of campaigns that we would want to do in public. And so one of the manifestations was these banners were used during the first International Women's Day protest in Tbilisi. They say things like, well, obviously feminist, my body, my choice, and no violence. So these were some of the things that they were thinking about in wanting to make a public protest. So back in Chicago, I mean, that project was taking place while I was working here at Columbia. I came to this school from New York. I had spent 12 years working in New York in the not-for-profit sector. I came here because it was the only full-time hand papermaking graduate school job in the world. And so I said, what is Chicago? Maybe I should go. So my husband and I packed up and we came here. It has been 17 years. I have been really passionate about this school and the things that it really adventurously undertakes. One of them was the Papermaker's Garden. So one of my graduate students wanted to start a garden. This is very common in hand papermaking, to grow the materials from which you make your work. And so the school invested on what is now the Student Center. It was a temporary space. It was known as a temporary space. They did bulldoze it a little early, but my therapist helped me work through that. There were 10 beds. So there was an architect who designed this for free, and they built 10 beds. So we quickly figured out that 10 beds was too much for my graduate students. And so my colleague and former student Maggie Puckett and I took 5 of them over as the Seeds and Service project, which I'll describe in a little bit. The space was phenomenal. I won't make Mimi bleep that one out. It had a soundstage. It had electricity and water hookup. So it was meant as sort of an interdisciplinary space to teach and learn. It was a very beautiful thing, and the community absolutely loved it. So we worked out there very happily from, someone might have to help me with my math, I think it was open in 2015, and 2019 was when it was dismantled. So during this time, I was growing materials and turning them into art. So I was really interested in the ways that we could curate seeds from different seed banks, do collaborative practice with people banking seeds for all kinds of heirloom seed movement, cultural preservation movements, and thinking about the ways that they could be interpreted into telling new stories. So this is me on our letterpresses. I love that studio. And we were making, for instance, lots of different things, but one of them was seed packets. And so the seed packets were distributing the seeds that were taken from the plants that were grown in the garden. And then the plants were made into paper, and then we would letterpress these stories on them and then distribute them. They were distributed to museums and galleries, but they were also distributed to people who were interested in planting them. So we started doing a lot of satellite gardening and supporting other people to do the kind of gardening that we were doing. It was also a performance space. I love News of the Weird, so we were just bringing in anything we possibly could. I was doing a lot of curatorial work, looking back to my work in the former Yugoslavia. This is the Bosnian tea. I did a Bosnian tea event with some of the diaspora who were making teas from the materials that I grew that went back into their own intangible heritage practices, their cultural practices. Sage, by the way, is really good for cavities, things like this. But we had a really interesting time growing materials and thinking through all different kinds of relationships with people ranging from the Zapatista radical community in Mexico, where women were producing heirloom seeds, to the experimental farm network that helped us propagate seeds from war-torn areas, Bosnia, of course, being a war-torn area, and thinking through the cultural differences and experiences of those people and the ways that our work could further knowledge about these, in some cases, dying traditions. On the right is SCOBY. We used to grow SCOBY. I had this guy from IIT come in like, we're going to make paper out of SCOBY. I'm like, all right, I'm on. So it doesn't work very well, but we were using the paper making vats to grow SCOBY. How many people have grown SCOBY in here? Anybody? SCOBY. It's wonderful and bizarre. So we were growing these really fat SCOBYs and trying to turn them into handmade paper, but it was super theatrical and a lot of fun. But Seeds and Service also was a space for people to come and really experiment. You know, the papermaking studio in that space was thinking through a lot of plant-based interdisciplinary collaboration. So, you know, here at Columbia, we think about things differently. the hand papermaking movement was considered in a very different way here at Columbia as an interdisciplinary medium. So I had long felt that the hand papermaking movement was actually a socially engaged movement. There are many people who were doing micro-industry projects internationally. And so Jessica Cochran, who's a curator here in Chicago, she and I co-produced social paper, hand papermaking in the context of socially engaged art. And in so doing, sort of carved out this idea that hand papermaking is a craft medium, but it's also a socially engaged medium, and showed people ranging from combat paper who pulp fatigues, combat fatigues into paper to create artworks, to Lauda Anderson Barbata, who's my muse, who was working on the repatriation of the remains of an exploited Mexican mezzo-soprano singer named Julia Pastrana. At the same time, I was starting to write a lot, because what I realized was, and I always tell students this, my graduate students have heard this, probably some of the undergraduate students have heard this. One of the most exciting things about working at the margins is that you get to create the discourse. So I was given a huge seat at the table to start writing about what I wanted. And so I started spinning this story about the feminist legacy of hand papermaking and its adjacencies to artist books. Columbia had not really considered that. We had a lot of men working in artist books. We brought on Miriam Scher, who really changed the way I thought about a lot of these things. But I traced some of the history back to the Women's Building in LA, which was Judy Chicago's Feminist Art Project program. Publishing was a cornerstone of their new dissemination, bad word for feminism, sorry, distribution methodology, where they wanted to tell the stories of women. Self-publish was the jam. So I started thinking about the ways that hand papermaking is sistered to this medium. As it turns out, at the Women's Building, there was a hand papermaking movement as well, but it's very poorly recorded. I tried to do some recording on it. But I started writing a lot, as Heather mentioned. So then, after many years of doing this work, COVID. Wow, that was a rough time for everybody's art practice. Teaching online and trying to make it real. I was fortunate to be working in a garden. This is a project I did for Tricia Van Eck with the Architecture Biennial. 6018 is her gallery. And I had a project called Flax Feminism, where I was looking at the intersection of my work as a hand papermaker with a lot of the intangible heritage craft practices of Yugoslavia. Flax is an ancient material, which they found all the way back to Lipinski Vir, which is many, many thousands of years ago, I think 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. They found evidence of flax back that far. Many of these cultures are pre-Christian and also goddess worshiping as opposed to patriarchal. So I was thinking through the sort of radical histories of flax. Here in the United States, flax was also a divestment from slave cotton. So the Quakers were using it as a form of divestment. So I was growing it, propagating it, studying the research. And I started doing a lot of oral history performance work where I would sort of tell these research narratives in an environment where I was actually making the paper. And then things kind of got a little crazy because I went totally stir crazy and was cut off from our supplies and materials. And I started cannibalizing my artwork of years and years of paper that I had accumulated, and started spinning it and weaving it and making it into artworks. And this was a really fun way for me to think through a practice that I only do on a tapestry loom. I don't know how to do floor loom weaving, but it was a really interesting way to tie not just the material, but also the technique that I was researching, which is women growing flax for material in order to make clothing and linens. This is a project I did, which was using a lot of my archives. So I was thinking also through the ways that these practices, these craft practices, tell stories generationally of the things that we have done in our past. I was also farming a lot of imagery that I had studied. One of the things I always say is, this is like a variation on the evil eye. I always tell my students, I'm not going to F-bomb. Don't with my crops, right? So that when we talk about evil eye internationally, there's a lot of, you see these images over and over again. They sometimes reflect things like burdock or plant types, but the evil eye is basically internationally: save me from famine, save my family, save me from starvation, right? Save me from, the rains. So I was going back through a lot of that history and symbolism that I had studied in places like Republic of Georgia, and then also more recently the indigenous communities here in the United States, because there are many, many similarities that show up in the types of symbol systems. This piece was done with a lot of plants that I grew in the papermaker's garden, including things like okra. Mokosh is the Balkan goddess of weaving. This is another archive project where I was spinning pieces of paper. I would cut them into strips, spin them on a drop spindle, which my father had given me when I was 16 years old, and weaving them on a tapestry loom and weaving in my archive of materials and practices. So they became my own, basically kind of my own intangible heritage. And so I had a really good time during COVID, even though COVID was the worst experience of my life. Well, that's not really true, but one of them. So artist books. So I talked about hand paper making, but artist books. So here at Columbia, we had the Center for Book and Paper. Artist books was part of that. I talked about how artist books were a method of distribution, a very important feminist method of distribution. Why not, right? Because if we're not being published, we can publish ourselves. And so there was a mass movement in offset printing that took place at the Women's Building. There were also artist books, but I work across all of those media. In this case, this is, I think, Lulu. It might be Lulu or Blurb. But the idea was that we needed to document the story of what we did in Republic of Georgia for two reasons. One, we were creating original scholarship on the practices that were disappearing. And two, that the women we worked with needed professional documentation for their micro-industry. So we produced limited editions of these print-on-demand books and then distributed them back to the communities that we were working with. And then these also have been distributed widely into library collections around the country so that researchers and people can access this material. This is another print-on-demand book, which told the 5-year history of the Seeds and Service Project, which I described earlier, an illuminated feminist seed bank. In here, we cataloged not just the stories of the gardens, but also our research on the plants, and also a bit of how-to, with the idea that part of our work was to propagate and push forward the things that we were doing into new publics. This is Bosnian Magic Garden. One of the most extraordinary experiences of my life was that I was reunited with a Bosnian refugee who I sponsored with my grandmother back in the 90s, and I was able to find her in 2015. Her name was Zena Spracho. She was sent to a refugee camp in Croatia. She was repatriated to her community. This is the view outside of her front garden. But so the Bosnian Magic Garden is in honor of her and the kinds of plants that she was growing as she was trying to come back to the place that had been leveled by the Serbs. I had an incredible opportunity to inter this book at the Global Seed Vault. And so my colleagues have heard this one before, but I say that it's really exciting to get a show at the MoMA, but for me to have my work at the Global Seed Vault, it's like done. But the idea was that the Global Seed Vault is collecting all of this seed material. For those of you who don't know the Seed Vault, the idea, it's a very utopic, maybe dystopic idea of collecting a doomsday vault of biologic material that would sort of help us when Armageddon comes. But it's in the permafrost in Svalbard, Norway. And so some of the scientists realized that we didn't really have the heritage of these seeds. Some of you may know that seeds and plants are in relationship to humans. So as we propagate them and we grow them, they change to what we need. And so there's a story behind every seed and every crop And these stories are, the Global Seed Vault is trying to animate those stories. And so we were very fortunate to have our book interred there. Partly also because the seeds that we were working with weren't just food seeds, they were also medicinal and craft-based seeds. The Seed Vault right now focuses on food crop seeds. This is a recent project called Invisible Labors, done with Susanna Papish. I did a project down at her space for the Terrain Biennial founded by our dearly departed former colleague, Sabina Ott. And Invisible Labors was concurrently about the invisible labor of the plants as they do their work underground. Prairie plants were in the prairie biome. Prairie plants tend to put a lot of their energy down before they bring it up. And that is because of the biome we live in. We have a lot of wind and tornadoes and rain. They're also incredible carbon remediators. So I was playing on this idea of invisible labors of the women who do these practices with the plants that I was growing, which also are doing their invisible work underground. This book charted 4 invisible stories by women who have been literally all but erased from Southside Chicago. Alice Kellogg Tyler, Kate Starr Kellogg, Louise Barwick, and Kelly Church has not been erased, but the work of the Potawatomi tribe and the basket making that was taking place in Chicagoland has certainly up until recently been erased. And so this animated a story of a painter, a radical pedagogue, a geologist, and a black ash basket maker, and looking at the ways that women working with the land are animating a new history in the time of climate crisis. This was a limited edition of 100, and it's been distributed as artist books like this are, distributed in special collections in museums. We were very fortunate to have it recently placed at the Field Museum and also at the Smithsonian. Part of the 50 of the edition have my handmade paper in them. This is burdock, which was grown in the Invisible Labors garden, and that is the recipe for how I make handmade paper from burdock, which is really for crazy people. If you want the greatest invisible labor, it is hand paper making, because you get about 12 sheets of paper for about 900 hours of work. But it's, again, it's, as some paper makers out here know, it attracts a type. This is, and we're functional. We're functional. So this is an image of me doing a community-based project, again, where I pull paper, but I also tell sort of oral histories about the things that I'm researching about the projects that I'm working on. So this is one of my more recent projects. This is Circle Garden Solastalgia. I'll just play the video. It's in Myth of the Organic City at 6018. It's a show that's taking place this fall up in Edgewater. The curator is Trisha Van Eck, and it's about land. And she's doing it as part of a Terra Foundation project. I think it's land, water, air, something else. But anyway, the idea of course, the ways that we need to reconsider our relationship to all of these things. So I will go ahead and play this. This is my attempt at an artist's book as a research tool to design a circular garden for her property, which was also the idea to break the grid, because Chicago is a gridded city. Okay, so I'm finishing up with my latest project, which is Feminist Seed Bank. I'm creating a database and multimedia project looking at the specific intersection of craft, plant-based craft, and climate change. Plant-based craft done by women in the era of climate change. I'm showing a project that I did in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Soros hits it again. I had funding to go to Bishkek to work in this wonderful project called Trash Festival, where I took my own craft of hand paper making again and used it as a tool to engage with young people whose parents live in the garbage dumps. Bishkek does not have recycling the way we do in this city. So there are people who make their living collecting recycling. And so the opportunity to do a recycled papermaking workshop with children who actually understood what recycling meant was one of the most profound experiences I've had in my life. And I will never teach another recycled hand papermaking project if it's not that meaningful. I think recycling just doesn't mean the same thing. But it was a project where, again, I was using my craft to sort of interact and engage. At the same time, because I never miss an opportunity to study the intangible heritage of that region. Once again, my colleague Sasha Swetchkovich was helping me sort of navigate through some of these things. You'll see on the left, this is an image from their museum. They're a nomadic culture. And so their history is quite recent. It's really fascinating the ways in which modern art just didn't evolve in the same way. Craft sort of merged into what we would think of as sort of turn of the century art because the city wasn't even established until the turn of the century by Soviets. Until then, it was a nomadic culture. These women, I had the unbelievable experience to interview these two women. Women in this region are referred to as grandma. So that I don't actually have their names. It's like boo-boo are their names, but their Sinyat Solocheva was one of the women I was working with on Trash Festival. They do something called chi, which is using grass that is grown in the steppes. And nomads, instead of making rugs, they actually spin wool on this grass and weave the strands of, you'll see a picture of it, but they weave strands together, sort of like a sushi mat, but covered in wool so that it looks like a rug. And these are the nomadic ways that they make rugs because they can't weave in the same way because they're nomadic and they can't use the same kinds of looms. So these are the kinds of projects that I'm trying to catalog. Feminist Seed Bank has grown a lot since I made this image, but I'm interviewing women all over the world. I have a new project in Michigan working with the indigenous community there, but cataloging endangered practices and animating them through propagation, online workshops and programs, and learning and collaboration across borders. The woman on the left is from Papua New Guinea. The method that she does is it's a grass straw made into what they call wombs, which are containers like baskets and like sling bags, but they actually are called wombs. They come from that tradition. So there's all this really interesting linguistic stuff that you learn about how they attribute the craft and what it means to them culturally that you learn through doing these kinds of interviews. I collaborate with ethnographers and anthropologists to interpret and research simultaneously the craft practice and the biological material on the plant. So this is a growing database and project. And I end with this slide. These are some of the collection of people that I've been working with. They're all totally amazing. This is chi. This is what I was talking about. I won't do this. This is chi. This is the wool that's done over the grass. To the right of that is himali, which is a Finnish method of straw sacred geometric designs. They're actually burned during the New Year. To the right of that is an ethnographer that I worked with for many years. One of his collaborators who's from Dagestan. These are all hand-dyed plant materials that are used for embroidery. All these are heavily symboled for birth, death, and wedding rituals. To the north of that, on the right, is the Potawatomi black ash basket tradition. This was used in our book. It's one of the only open source images of Potawatomi black ash basketry. It's for sale. That's a whole other sidebar conversation we will have in craft culture and history. But in the middle top, those are dolls. Those are like basically kind of the equivalent of worry dolls, also made in Kyrgyzstan, and they're made out of the grasses. I would say that they are somewhere between like worry dolls and voodoo dolls. And then this is Bilam, which I described earlier. One of the ways that they're trying to protect and preserve that methodology is to take it into the fashion world. So this is an image of the Bilam being used for fashion. And so I'm going to end there. That's what I've been working on. Thank you.